The dinner party at Hartwell Manor was going perfectly, until the Duke of Ravensmere dropped his fork. It was not the food. The pheasant was excellent. The wine was French and expensive, and Lord Hartwell had made sure everyone at the table knew it. No, it was the sound coming faintly through the kitchen door. A voice, young, soft, tired, singing a French lullaby over the clatter of pots. The Duke went very still. He had heard that lullaby only once in his life, 20 years ago, sung by a woman who, according to everyone who knew her, had no children at all. And in that moment, in the warm candlelight of Lord Hartwell's dining room, the Duke of Ravensmere asked himself a question that would tear that house apart. Who is singing in the kitchen? 6 hours earlier, Margaret had been awake before the sun. She was always awake before the sun. That was the first rule of her life. The scullery fire had to be lit, the water hauled, the bread started, all before the grand family upstairs opened their eyes. Margaret was 22 years old, and she had lived at Hartwell Manor for as long as she could remember, not as a daughter of the house, not even as a proper servant with wages and a half-day off. She was something less than that, something without a name. The other servants called her the cook's girl. The family, on the rare occasions they spoke of her at all, called her the charity case. She slept on a straw mat by the kitchen hearth. She owned 2 dresses, both gray, both patched so many times that the original cloth was only a rumor. And she ate what was left when everyone else, family, guests, footmen, even the stable boys had eaten first. Scraps, crusts, the fat trimmed off the meat, the porridge burnt to the bottom of the pot. For years, Margaret had told herself it didn't matter. Food was food. But there were nights, lying by the dying fire with her stomach aching, when she wondered what she had done, what terrible thing she must have done as a baby to deserve so little. "You did nothing, child," Mrs. Bramble would say whenever Margaret dared to ask. "Nothing at all, now hush." Mrs. Bramble, the cook, a wide, iron-haired woman with forearms like a blacksmith and a voice that could stop a footman at 40 paces. She was the closest thing to a mother Margaret had ever known. It was Mrs. Bramble who had fed her secretly when she was small, a stolen egg here, a heel of good bread there. Mrs. Bramble who had taught her letters by scratching them in the flour dust. Mrs. Bramble who had sat up with her through fevers that no one upstairs ever asked about. And it was Mrs. Bramble who had given her the one strange rule that governed her entire life. Never speak French where anyone can hear you. Margaret didn't know why she knew French. She simply always had the way she knew how to breathe. The words lived in her like a second heartbeat. When she was alone, scrubbing pots in the empty scullery, whole sentences would rise up in her, elegant and old-fashioned, and she never knew where they came from. Once as a child she had asked, "Mrs. Bramble who taught me French." The cook had gone pale, actually pale. This woman who had once chased a rat out of the pantry with her bare hands and gripped Margaret by both shoulders. "No one taught you. You don't know it. Do you understand me, girl? If anyone in this house ever hears French come out of your mouth, they will send you away to a place far worse than this one, and I will not be able to save you." Margaret had been 7 years old. She had never forgotten the fear in Mrs. Bramble's eyes. So she kept the rule. For 15 years she kept it. Until tonight. Tonight the house was in an uproar. The Duke of Ravensmere himself was coming to dinner, the richest man in the county, perhaps in 3 counties, a man so far above the Hartwells that Lady Hartwell had changed her gown 4 times before sunset. Every servant had been worked half to death. Margaret had hauled water, plucked birds, scrubbed floors, and polished silver she would never be permitted to touch again. And as always, before the guests arrived, came the second rule of her life. Lady Hartwell swept into the kitchen, looked at Margaret the way one looks at a stain on the carpet, and said what she always said. "Keep that asterisk out of sight. If any guest so much as glimpses her, Mrs. Bramble, you will both regret it." So Margaret stayed in the scullery, behind the kitchen, behind the world. Dish after dish went up. Course after course came back down. She scraped the plates of the fine people upstairs and set aside, without even thinking about it anymore, the largest scraps for her own supper. By midnight her hands were raw, her back was screaming, and her mind was floating somewhere far away, the way it did when she was too tired to guard herself. And that was when it happened. A pot in her hand, steam rising, her eyes half closed. And a melody, rising out of her like a memory that belonged to someone else, soft words in perfect French. A lullaby about a little bird flying home across the sea. She didn't even realize she was singing. In the scullery doorway, a young footman froze with a tray of dessert plates in his hands, his mouth falling open. And beyond the kitchen door, in the glittering dining room, the Duke of Ravensmere, a man famous for never showing surprise at anything, dropped his fork onto Lady Hartwell's finest porcelain and slowly turned his head toward the sound. At the head of the table, Lord Hartwell was still laughing at his own joke. He had no idea that the ruin of his entire house had just begun, with a lullaby. The dining room had gone on as if nothing had happened. Lady Hartwell was describing, at great length, the difficulty of finding good lace since the war. Lord Hartwell was refilling his own glass more often than his guests. The vicar's wife was laughing at everything the Duke said, though the Duke had said almost nothing all evening. That was his way. The Duke of Ravensmere was 34 years old, unmarried and famously unreadable. Hostesses across the county had ruined entire dinner parties trying to make him smile. He watched. He listened. He gave nothing away. But if anyone at that table had truly been watching him, they would have seen it. The way his eyes kept drifting toward the servant's door. The way his thumb moved slowly along the stem of his glass, again and again, like a man turning a question over in his mind. The singing had lasted only a few seconds. A pot had clanged, a door had shut, and the voice had vanished. No one else at the table had even noticed it. But the Duke had not heard a servant girl singing. He had heard a ghost. He waded through dessert. He waded through Lord Hartwell's long story about a horse he had once sold to a baron. And then, in the small silence while the plates were being cleared, the Duke set down his glass and asked, in the mild voice of a man asking about the weather, "Tell me, Hartwell, who is the girl in your kitchen?" The clatter of a serving spoon, a footman fumbling, catching it, apologizing. Lord Hartwell blinked. "The girl? Which girl? We keep several kitchen maids, your grace. I confess I couldn't name them all." He laughed, pleased with himself. "That's what I pay a housekeeper for." "This one sings," said the Duke, "in French." It was as if the temperature in the room dropped. Later, much later, Margaret would learn everything that happened at that table, told to her by a footman who had seen it all. And what he remembered most was not Lord Hartwell's face. It was Lady Hartwell's. Her ladyship went white. Not pale, white asterisk, the color of the tablecloth, so suddenly that the vicar's wife leaned over and asked if she was unwell. Lord Hartwell recovered first. He chuckled, but the chuckle came out wrong, too quick and too loud. "Ah, that will be the foundling. A charity case, your grace. My wife's soft heart, you understand, some orphan left to the parish years ago. We gave her a roof out of Christian kindness." He waved his hand as if brushing away a fly. "Simple creature, half-witted, truth be told, sings nonsense sounds to herself. I doubt very much it was French. I doubt she could spell her own name." "Nonsense sounds," the Duke repeated softly. "Just so." The Duke nodded slowly and said nothing more about it. He allowed the conversation to move on to hunting, and the vicar's wife breathed again, and Lord Hartwell told another story about another horse. But the Duke had grown up with a French tutor his father had brought from Paris at enormous expense. He had heard peasant French and merchant French and schoolbook French. What he had heard through that kitchen door was none of those things. It was the French of old drawing rooms and older bloodlines, accented, graceful, aristocratic. The kind of French that could not be imitated, only inherited. And the song itself, the little bird flying home across the sea, was not a song anyone sang anymore. He had heard it once, 20 years ago, as a boy of 14 standing in the doorway of his father's study, watching a beautiful dark-haired Frenchwoman weep quietly by the fire while she sang it to herself. A guest of his father's, a woman spoken of, afterward, only in whispers. A woman his dying father had begged him, begged him, gripping his hand with the last of his strength, to find. The Duke of Ravensmere smiled politely at Lord Hartwell's story and lifted his glass and thought, "You are lying to me, and I am going to find out why." Down in the kitchen, the fear arrived before the family did. The young footman had talked. Of course he had talked. By the time the last guest's carriage rolled away down the drive, every servant at Hartwell Manor knew that the strange, silent girl from the scullery had been singing in French, and that the Duke himself had asked about her. Margaret stood by the hearth, still holding a dish rag, as the whispers moved around her like smoke. "I didn't mean to," she said quietly. "I didn't even know I was." "Hush," Mrs. Bramble's face was gray. She looked suddenly 10 years older. "Hush, child, maybe it will pass. Maybe they'll." The kitchen door slammed open. It was not Lady Hartwell. It was Lord Hartwell himself, and in 22 years Margaret could not remember him ever setting foot in the kitchen. He filled the doorway, his face flushed with wine and something else, something that looked almost like panic wearing the mask of rage. "You," he pointed at Margaret. "What did you say? What did you sing? Who taught you?" "My lord, it was only a tune, I don't." "Who taught you?" "No one, my lord, I swear it. I don't know where it comes from, it's just in me." For a moment, something flickered across Lord Hartwell's face that frightened Margaret more than his shouting ever had. He looked at her the way a man looks at a debt he thought he had buried. "Take her downstairs," he said to the footman behind him. "The cellar, lock it." Mrs. Bramble stepped in front of Margaret so fast her ladle clattered to the floor. "My lord, please, she's done nothing. She's a good girl. She works harder than any 3 maids in this house." "It's for her own good, Bramble." Lord Hartwell's voice was flat now and cold. "The girl is clearly unwell, confused. She needs quiet until we decide what's to be done with her." 2 footmen took Margaret by the arms. She didn't fight. Fighting had never once helped her in that house. But as they pulled her toward the cellar stairs, she looked back over her shoulder. Mrs. Bramble stood frozen by the hearth, one hand pressed to her mouth. And on the old cook's face was an expression Margaret had seen only once before, 15 years ago, over a lesson scratched in flour dust. Not anger, not even sorrow. Terror. The cellar door closed. The key turned, and Margaret sat down in the darkness among the wine racks and the winter apples, hugging her knees, asking the darkness the question she had asked her whole life. What am I? What did I do? She did not know that 4 miles away, in a carriage rolling through the night toward Ravensmere Castle, a duke was staring out the window asking almost the same question. Who are you, girl? And why does a kitchen maid at Hartwell Manor have Vivienne de Rosso's voice? Margaret spent 2 days in the cellar. They were not cruel about it, not in the way the world could see. Food came down twice a day, carried by a frightened kitchen maid who wouldn't meet her eyes. A blanket appeared on the 2nd night. But the key always turned again, and the darkness always came back. Strangely, it was Mrs. Bramble's absence that frightened her most. In 22 years, the cook had never once let a day pass without seeing her. Now nothing. No heavy footsteps on the cellar stairs, no gruff voice through the door. They won't let her come, Margaret realized. They're keeping her away from me. On the third morning, the key turned at an unusual hour, and Lady Hartwell herself stood at the top of the stairs, holding a lamp and looking down at Margaret the way one looks into a well. "Wash yourself," she said. "Put on a clean apron. You will work in the scullery today and you will not make a sound, not one word, not one asterisk note asterisk. Do you understand me, girl?" "Yes, my lady." Lady Hartwell paused, and then she said something she had never said in 22 years, something almost gentle, which made it far more terrifying than any threat. "It would have been better for you," she said quietly, "if you had never been born with that voice." She turned and went up the stairs, and Margaret stood in the cold light from the open door, shaking. She did not know that the reason for her sudden release was already rolling up the front drive. The Duke of Ravensmere had given himself an excuse so thin that even his own coachman had raised an eyebrow. Horses. Lord Hartwell kept a stable of hunters he was forever boasting about, and so the Duke had written a short note. He found himself in need of 2 good hunters. He recalled Hartwell's fine stock. Might he call on Thursday? No man in England refuses a duke who wants to give him money. The reply came back within hours, dripping with delight. And so, on Thursday morning, the Duke walked the stable yard at Hartwell Manor, nodding at horses he had no intention of buying, while Lord Hartwell talked and talked and talked. "And this bay, your grace, sired by a stallion my late brother purchased in Ireland, jumps like a cat, I assure you." Said the Duke. He bought the bay. He bought a grey mare as well, paying too much for both without bargaining, which put Lord Hartwell in such a fine mood that he grew careless. That was what the Duke had been waiting for. "I wonder," the Duke said as they walked back toward the house, "if I might trouble you for something to drink," and he glanced at the sky, mild as milk. "Perhaps I'll take a turn through the gardens first. Alone, if you'll forgive me. I think better on my feet." "Of course, your grace, of course. My gardens are your gardens." Lord Hartwell hurried inside to shout at servants about refreshments, and the Duke of Ravensmere turned, quite deliberately, down the path that led not to the rose garden, but around the east wing, past the woodpile, toward the kitchen yard. He found her at the pump. A thin girl in a patched gray dress, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hauling water with the mechanical motion of someone who has done it 10,000 times. There were bruises on her wrists, the shape of fingers. Her face was pale from days without sunlight. But it was not the bruises that stopped the Duke where he stood. It was her eyes. Dark, wide-set, with a particular tilt at the corners. Eyes he had last seen 20 years ago, wet with tears in his father's study. Good God, he thought, it's her face. It's her face in a servant's dress. Margaret saw the shadow fall across the ground and turned and froze. A gentleman, tall, dark-coated, unmistakably grand, standing in the kitchen yard where gentlemen never, ever came. Every rule of her life screamed at once, out of sight, you are not to be seen. The bucket slipped. Water went everywhere, soaking her hem and his boots. "Oh, forgive me, my lord, She dropped into a clumsy curtsy, eyes on the ground, waiting for the shout, the blow, the punishment that always came. Instead, the gentleman said, in a calm and quiet voice, "Eneas papur, mademoiselle, si inestque de elo." "Don't be afraid, miss, it's only water." And Margaret, exhausted, frightened, 22 years old and starved of one single moment of kindness, answered before her mind could stop her mouth. "Si sont vos bottes que j'y crains, monsieur, elo satura liqueur, jamais." "It's your boots I fear for, sir. Water dries, leather never forgives." The words came out smooth as silk, old-fashioned, perfectly formed. the French of a drawing room that had not existed for 30 years. Silence in the kitchen yard. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. The color drained from her face as 15 years of Mrs. Bramble's warnings came crashing down on her at once. Forgive me. I don't know French, my lord. I don't know what that was." "You do," the Duke said softly, "and it is the finest French I have heard since my tutor died." He took one step closer. "What is your name?" She should have run. She should have said nothing. But there was something in the way he looked at her, not through her, the way the family looked, not past her, the way guests looked, but add asterisk her, as if she were a person standing in a yard, and it undid her completely. "Margaret," she whispered, "just Margaret, your grace." "And your mother, what was her name?" "I never knew her, your grace. They told me she was a laundress. She died of a fever when I was small, that's all anyone ever said." Her voice dropped. "That's all I am. I'm no one, your grace. Please, please don't tell them I spoke. They'll send me away, or worse." The Duke looked at this girl, at the aristocrat's French and the laundress's story, at the bruised wrists and the eyes of Vivienne de Rosso, and felt something cold settle in his chest. "They told him she was dead of a fever. They told my father there was no child at all. Someone has been lying for 20 years, and this girl is the lie." Voices from the house. Lord Hartwell calling for his grace, growing nearer. The Duke stepped back, but before he turned to go, he said one thing, quickly and quietly, in French, words Margaret would repeat to herself in the dark for many nights to come. "Vous n'êtes pas no one, mademoiselle, et je vais le prouver." "You are not no one, miss, and I am going to prove it." Then he was gone, striding around the corner of the east wing, greeting Lord Hartwell in a bored voice about the excellence of the gardens. Margaret stood alone by the pump, her heart slamming, water soaking into her shoes. From the kitchen window, behind the glass, Mrs. Bramble had seen everything. The old cook closed her eyes and her lips moved, half a prayer, half a decision 20 years in the making. "It's time," she thought. "God help us all, it's time." Mrs. Bramble waited until nightfall. She waited until the kitchen was empty, until the last candle in the servants' hall had been snuffed, until the great house above her had gone quiet. Then she took off her apron, folded it neatly over a chair, the way a soldier lays down his coat before a battle, and climbed the stairs she was never supposed to climb. She knocked on the door of Lady Hartwell's private sitting room. It says something about the state of Lady Hartwell's nerves that she was still awake, still dressed, sitting bolt upright by a dying fire at midnight. And it says even more that when she saw the cook standing in her doorway, cook upstairs, uninvited, at midnight, she did not scream or ring the bell or demand an explanation. She simply said in a flat voice, "Close the door." Mrs. Bramble closed it. For a long moment the two women looked at each other across the room, the lady in her silk, the cook in her worn gray wool, and 20 years of silence stood between them like a third person. "He recognized her," Mrs. Bramble said. "You don't know that." "I've got eyes, my lady. I saw him in the kitchen yard today. I saw his face when she spoke." The old cook's hands were shaking, but her voice held. "That man didn't stumble into the kitchen yard by accident. Dukes don't buy horses they don't need and wander past woodpiles. He came for her asterisk. It's over, my lady. Whatever this has been, it's over." "Lower your voice." "I've lowered my voice for 20 years. It came out as a fierce whisper, which was somehow louder than a shout. I've held my tongue since the night they carried that baby through the kitchen door. I asked no questions, just as I was paid to ask none. You hired a cook who spoke no French, didn't you? I always wondered why that mattered so much. Took me years to work it out." Lady Hartwell rose from her chair. In the firelight her face looked carved from wax. "You forget yourself, Bramble." "No, my lady. For the first time in 20 years I remember myself." Mrs. Bramble took a breath. I'm not asking you to confess anything. I'm asterisk begging you let the girl go, tonight. Give her a reference and 10 pounds and put her on the mail coach and let her disappear before that man comes back with questions you can't answer. Because he will asterisk come back. His kind always does. And when he does, everything that happens after will be on your head and his lordship's, not mine, and not that innocent child's. For a moment, one single moment, something almost human moved in Lady Hartwell's face. Something that might have been 20 years of sleepless nights. You think I chose this, she said quietly. You think I wanted that child under my roof, at my table? No, not at my table, never at my table. A short, bitter laugh. You have no idea what my husband did, Bramble, what we owe, what that girl is asterisk. Then tell me. She is ruin, Lady Hartwell said. Walking, breathing ruin. Every day for 20 years I have looked at that girl and seen the gallows. She caught herself, pressed her lips together too late. The word was out, hanging in the air between them. Gallows. Mrs. Bramble went very still. Whatever she had suspected all these years, debts, a scandal, a nobleman's misplaced child, none of it had included that word. My lady, she said slowly, what is under this roof? Lady Hartwell turned to the fire. When she spoke again, her voice was drained of everything. Go back to your kitchen, Bramble, forget the girl. His lordship will deal with the matter, he is already dealing with it. And if you value the roof over your own head, you will be deaf and blind for a few days more. That is all it will take. A few days. She paused. After that, there will be nothing left to see. Mrs. Bramble walked back down the servants' stairs, with her heart pounding in her ears. A few days. After that, there will be nothing left to see. She had heard threats before. This was not a threat. This was a plan already in motion. In the kitchen, the fire had burned down to embers. Margaret was asleep on her straw mat by the hearth, one arm curled under her head, her face, even in sleep, turned toward the warmth like a plant toward the sun. Mrs. Bramble stood over her for a long moment. She remembered the night the child had arrived. A hired coach, long past midnight, in the worst November rain she'd ever seen. A bundle handed through the kitchen door, not through the front door, never the front door, and inside the bundle, a girl of perhaps 2 years, dark-eyed, silent, clutching a lady's handkerchief with a bird embroidered in the corner. Lord Hartwell, soaked to the knees, whispering furiously with a man Mrs. Bramble had never seen before and never saw again. And one other thing. A thing the men had carried in with the child and shoved at the new cook with a single instruction. Put this somewhere and forget it exists. She had been hired only 6 days before. A widow, plain, unlettered in anything but English, desperate for a place. She hadn't dared to ask. She had simply obeyed. But she hadn't forgotten. Mrs. Bramble took the candle stub, went into the larder and shut the door behind her. She moved the flour barrel, heavier every year, or perhaps she was just older, and knelt down on the cold stone with a grunt. Third flagstone from the wall. Her fingers found the worn edge they had found only twice in 20 years. The stone lifted. There, wrapped in oilcloth, gray with dust, exactly where it had waited out the girl's whole life, lay a small writing box of dark polished wood. A lady's box. On its lid, inlaid in brass, was a crest, a bird in flight over 3 stars. And beneath the crest, engraved in flowing letters, 2 words in a language Mrs. Bramble had spent 20 years pretending not to recognize. Vida Rosso. The old cook knelt on the larder floor with the box in her hands, listening to the sleeping house above her. The house that planned to make a girl disappear in asterisk a few days, and made her choice. Right then, she whispered to the dark. You want deaf and blind, my lady. You should have picked a stupider cook. She did not open the box. It was locked, and it had never been hers to open. But she knew now exactly whose hands it belonged in, and 4 miles away, behind the walls of Ravensmere Castle, That man was very likely still awake. The only question was whether there was still time. Mrs. Bramble never got her chance. Her plan had been simple. At first light, she would send word to the castle by way of the carrier's boy, a note, carefully worded, asking nothing and hinting everything. She could not walk 4 miles and back before breakfast without being missed, and if she was missed, they would look at Margaret. No, the carrier's boy then. Quiet. Safe. She had wrapped the writing box in a clean flour sack and hidden it in the one place no one would ever look. The bottom of the swill bucket cupboard, behind the grease jars. But the Hartwells had been awake that night too, and they had moved first. It began at breakfast, upstairs, with a scream. Not a real scream, Margaret would understand that later. A performed scream, pitched perfectly to carry down 2 staircases. Lady Hartwell's maid came flying into the kitchen, wide-eyed, breathless with the news. Her ladyship's diamond brooch was gone. The brooch, the asterisk brooch, the one her ladyship's own mother had left her, worth more than every servant in the house earned in 10 years put together. Search everything, the housekeeper announced, arriving with 2 footmen behind her like soldiers. His lordship's orders, every trunk, every mattress, every servant's box. No one leaves the house. The servants stood in a row in the kitchen while the search went on above and below. A scullery maid was crying quietly. The footmen turned out cupboards, drawers, coat pockets. Margaret stood at the end of the row next to Mrs. Bramble and felt nothing at first but the ordinary dull fear of the powerless. She owned nothing. She had nothing to search. Her whole life fit on a straw mat by the hearth. It was when the housekeeper walked asterisk directly to that straw mat. No hesitation, no searching, straight to it, as if following a map, that Mrs. Bramble's blood ran cold. The housekeeper knelt, lifted the corner of the thin mattress. And there, glittering against the gray straw, ticking like a star fallen into mud, lay Lady Hartwell's diamond brooch. The kitchen went silent. "No," Margaret said. Her voice came out very small. "No, that's not. I've never touched it. I've never even seen asterisk it. I'm not allowed above stairs. Everyone knows I'm not allowed." "She's never been alone above stairs in her life," Mrs. Bramble roared, stepping forward. "Who found it so quick then? Straight to her bed like a dog to a bone. Who asterisk told you where to?" "That will do, Bramble." Lord Hartwell stood in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed for travel, Margaret noticed, in some distant, floating part of her mind. Boots, greatcoat over his arm, as if he had somewhere to be, as if all of this were merely one item on a list of morning errands. "Well," he said, looking at the brooch in the housekeeper's palm, and then at Margaret with an expression of deep, sorrowful disappointment that never reached his eyes. "So this is how 20 years of charity is repaid." "My lord, I swear on my life." "On your life," he nodded slowly. "An interesting choice of words. Do you know what the law does with thieves, girl, for an item of that value?" He let the silence do its work. Somewhere in the row of servants, the scullery maid sobbed out loud. "Transportation if the judge is merciful, the gallows if he is not." Gallows. The word Lady Hartwell had let slip in the firelight. Mrs. Bramble felt the whole design click together, cog by cog, and it was so cold and so complete that for a moment she couldn't breathe. They weren't just getting rid of the girl. They were asterisk branding her on the way out. A thief, a liar. So that if a duke ever came asking after her, if she ever dared to tell her strange story to anyone, anywhere, for the rest of her life, the answer would already be waiting. That girl, a criminal, stole from the very family that raised her out of Christian pity. You cannot believe a word she says. "However," Lord Hartwell went on, raising a hand as if staying an execution, "I am not a cruel man. I have no wish to see a young woman hang for the weakness of her nature. There is an institution in the North, a workhouse, where such creatures can be corrected through honest labor. She will be taken there this morning. The matter of the brooch will remain a private family disappointment." He paused. "Provided she goes quietly." "You planted it." Mrs. Bramble's voice was low and shaking. "You planted it, you son of a—" "You are dismissed, Bramble." The words dropped like a blade. 30 years, Lord Hartwell said, pulling on one glove, "and I confess I expected better judgment from you than to defend a thief. You will be paid through the quarter, which is more than you deserve. You will be off my land within the hour." And Bramble, he looked at her at last, and beneath the performance, just for a second, she saw the naked fear that was driving all of it. "If one word of this morning's unpleasantness travels beyond these walls, I will remember, quite suddenly, that the search of the kitchen was never finished. Do we understand one another?" The box. He didn't know where it was, she could see that, but he knew it existed, and he knew what finding it in her asterisk possession would mean for her. 2 footmen took Margaret's arms, the same 2 as before. They wouldn't look at her either. As they pulled her toward the cellar stairs to wait for the cart, she twisted around, searching for the one face that had never once failed her. "Mrs. Bramble." "Look at me, child." The old cook's voice cracked across the kitchen like a whip, and Margaret looked. "Whatever happens, whatever they say, wherever they take you, you are not what they call you. Do you hear me? You never were. Hold on to that. Hold on." The cellar door slammed. The key turned, that sound Margaret knew better than any music. And Mrs. Bramble stood in the middle of the kitchen that had been her kingdom for 30 years, stripped of everything in the space of 10 minutes, while the household stared and Lord Hartwell walked out to see about the cart. They watched her pack her one trunk. They escorted like a criminal, to the end of the drive. The last thing she saw of Hartwell Manor was a footman posted at the gate to make sure she kept walking. The rain began an hour later. Mrs. Bramble stood at the crossroads in it, 61 years old, homeless, with a trunk she could barely lift and a flour sack clutched under her cloak, because 30 years of loyalty had bought her one final minute alone in the kitchen, and she had spent it at the swill bucket cupboard. The village lay 1 mile to the east, shelter, an inn, sense. Ravensmere Castle lay 11 miles to the west, through the rain, through the dark that was coming. Down in the cellar of Hartwell Manor, Margaret heard, faintly through the stone, the sound of the cart being made ready in the yard, the cart that would come for her at dawn. Mrs. Bramble picked up her trunk, turned her face to the west, and started walking. 11 miles is nothing in a carriage. On foot at 61 in November rain, with a trunk in one hand and a lifetime of standing over hot stoves in your knees, 11 miles is a war. Mrs. Bramble fought it 1 milestone at a time. She abandoned the trunk at the second milestone, pushing it into the hedgerow. 30 years of her life was in that trunk, her Sunday dress, her late husband's watch, her mother's Bible, and she left it in the mud without looking back. The flour sack under her cloak she kept. Her arms went numb around it and she kept it. By the 6th milestone, the rain had soaked through wool, through linen, through skin. By the 8th, she was talking out loud to God, to her feet, to her dead husband, to the girl in the cellar. "Hold on, child," she muttered into the wind again and again in rhythm with her steps. "Hold on, hold on." Twice she fell. Twice the world offered her the same suggestion, "Lie down, old woman, you've done enough." And twice she answered it by getting up, because Margaret had spent 20 years getting up, and Mrs. Bramble would be damned before she managed less. It was past midnight when the lights of Ravensmere Castle finally rose out of the dark ahead of her, high windows, still lit, floating above the black trees like something out of a story. She hammered on the gatehouse door with the flat of her frozen hand. The porter who opened it beheld a mud-caked, rain-drowned old woman swaying on her feet, clutching a filthy flour sack to her chest like an infant, and reached the only reasonable conclusion. "Good God, off with you, mother, the kitchen gives bread at 8, come back at. I must see the Duke." The porter actually laughed. Not unkindly, that was the worst of it. The Duke, at 1 in the morning, shall I wake the king as well? He began to close the door. There's a barn by the... Mrs. Bramble put her foot in the door. 61 years old, half dead, and she put her foot in a duke's door. You tell him, she said, and her voice came out of her chest like something dragged over gravel. You tell his grace there is a woman at his gate who knows why his father died searching for Vivienne de Rosso. The porter stopped. He didn't know the name, but he had been in service long enough to know the asterisk sound of a name that mattered, and he knew, as every servant at Ravensmere knew, that the old Duke had died a haunted man, whispering to the end about a promise unkept. Wait here, he said. He was gone 11 minutes. Mrs. Bramble counted them by her own heartbeats, leaning against the gatehouse wall, holding the sack. Then footsteps, many footsteps fast. The great door swung wide, spilling light into the rain, and there, in his shirt sleeves, no coat, no ceremony, stood the Duke of Ravensmere himself. He looked at the ruined old woman on his doorstep. You're the cook, he said, from Hartwell. He'd seen her, of course he'd seen her that day in the kitchen yard, the face at the window. He stepped out into the rain in his shirt sleeves. Where is the girl? And Mrs. Bramble, who had held herself together for 11 miles, felt her knees finally buckle. But she got the words out first, the ones she had rehearsed with every step. They're taking her at dawn, your grace. A cart going north, they've called her a thief. They planted her ladyship's brooch under her bed with their own hands. It's murder by paperwork, that's what it is. And this, she pushed the flour sack at him with the last of her strength, this came with her the night they brought her. 20 years under my larder floor. It was never mine to open. I think it was always yours to find. The Duke pulled the sodden sacking away. Dark polished wood, a brass crest, a bird in flight over 3 stars, and 2 engraved words that struck him like a blow because he had seen that crest before, on a handkerchief his father had kept locked in a desk drawer until the day he died. V. de Rosso. For a moment, the Duke of Ravensmere stood absolutely still in the rain. Then he turned to the doorway, and the household learned that their unreadable, unshakable master had a voice they had never heard before. Wake the stables. My horse, not the carriage, the asterisk horse asterisk. Now, dry clothes and a fire and a doctor for this woman, she is my guest, and if she wants the moon, fetch it. He was already moving. And send a rider to my solicitor in the town. Tell him to be standing on his doorstep at first light with everything he has on the Hartwell family, everything going back 25 years. Your Grace, the porter ventured. It's 1 in the morning, dawn's not for 5 hours yet, surely the carriage. They move at dawn, the Duke said, swinging up into the saddle in the rain, the writing box bound to him under his greatcoat. So I move now. Dawn came gray and mean over Hartwell Manor. They brought Margaret up from the cellar with her wrists tied asterisk, as if she were dangerous, as if she had ever in her life been dangerous to anything, and put her in the back of a covered cart that smelled of old straw and other people's misery. A hired man she'd never seen sat up front. The housekeeper watched from the steps. No one else came out at all. 22 years, and her leaving weighed less than a delivery of coal. Where are we going? Margaret asked as the cart lurched into motion. North, the hired man said and spat. That was all. The manor slid away behind the hedgerows, the only world she had ever known, the kitchen, the hearth, the straw mat, gone between one bend in the road and the next. Margaret found, to her own dull surprise, that she did not cry. Perhaps there was a bottom to tears, and she had reached it. You are not what they call you, Mrs. Bramble had said. You never were. She held on to that. It was the only thing they'd let her take. The Duke had ridden through the last of the night like a man pursued rather than pursuing. He reached the lane to Hartwell Manor just past dawn, his horse blown and steaming, and pulled up at the crossroads a half-mile from the gates. Two roads. The North Road, through the village, the honest way north, the way anyone would go. And the Old Drove Road, east over the heath, longer, rougher, forgotten. The way you'd go if you didn't want to be seen. Fresh cart tracks marked the mud at the mouth of the North Road, plain as handwriting. North, the Duke breathed. Of course, he said workhouse, said north. And he turned his exhausted horse onto the North Road and drove it hard, through the village, past the church, 2 miles, 3, scanning every bend for a covered cart. The road ahead lay empty to the horizon. He didn't understand it, a loaded cart. Half an hour's start at most. He should have run it down long since, until he crested the last hill and saw the North Road stretching bare and innocent all the way to the moors, and the truth turned over in his stomach like ice. The tracks at the crossroads had been fresh, 2 asterisk fresh, 2 plain, an empty cart sent north at first light for exactly this purpose. Lord Hartwell had known someone might follow. The Duke wheeled his staggering horse around on the empty road, and for the first time in his adult life, the man famous for never showing anything threw back his head and shouted at the sky. One word, raw, useless. No. Far away to the east, on the Old Drove Road over the heath, a covered cart rattled steadily toward the coast, carrying a girl with tied wrists, who did not know that help had come, and had turned the wrong way. The Duke rode back into Ravensmere's courtyard on a horse that could barely stand, and his face told the whole household everything before he said a word. Mrs. Bramble was waiting in the hall. They had dried her, wrapped her, put hot brandy in her. She had refused the bed. She had refused it in such terms that the housekeeper had simply brought her a chair instead, and there she sat, facing the door, upright as a church tower. You didn't find her. The tracks went north. The road was empty. The Duke stripped off his gloves, and Mrs. Bramble noticed his hands weren't quite steady. He sent an empty cart up the North Road as a false trail and took her another way. He planned for me. He's been planning for 20 years. I've been planning since Thursday. Then we've lost her. No, the word came out flat and hard. A man doesn't build a false trail unless the real one leads somewhere he can't explain. Wherever she's truly going, it's worse than a workhouse, which means somewhere off the books, which means paid men, papers, arrangements. Arrangements leave marks. My solicitor is already digging. He looked at the old woman in the chair. But there is one thing in this house that may tell us faster than any solicitor. The writing box sat on the library table where he had ordered it placed, still dark with rain. A locksmith had been pulled from his bed in the town and stood by nervously with his tools. But when the Duke examined the small brass lock, he raised a hand and was still for a moment. Then he drew from his own pocket a small key on a worn ribbon, a key he had carried for 2 years, ever since he had cleared out his dead father's desk, and found it in a locked drawer, alone, labeled in his father's hand with a single word, someday. He had never found the lock it belonged to. He had never stopped carrying it. The key turned as if it had been made yesterday. Inside, the 20 years fell away. Everything was dry, ordered, exact, packed by a woman who had known she might never come back, and had refused to let panic make her careless. On top, a christening gown, tiny ivory silk gone soft as breath with age, embroidered at the hem, over and over in white thread that only showed when the light moved, a bird in flight over 3 stars. She wore that, Mrs. Bramble said quietly, from the chair no one had heard her leave. She stood gripping the table's edge. The night they brought her, I took it off the child myself and they burned it in the kitchen fire. I thought asterisk they burned it. Her ladyship must have. She stopped. No, this is another, made in pairs. Her mother kept the twin. Beneath the gown, tied in blue ribbon, letters, dozens of them in French in a swift, elegant hand. The Duke lifted the first and began to translate aloud, and his voice, steady at the start, did not stay steady. They were letters from Vivienne de Rosso to her infant daughter, written to be read someday by a grown woman in case. My little bird, if you are reading this, then I did not come back and someone kind has kept faith with me. Know first this, you were never abandoned. You were never unwanted. You are the only thing I have ever done in this world that matters. Mrs. Bramble sat down again, abruptly, and put her hand over her mouth. The letters told the story piece by piece. Vivienne de Rosso, the last of an old French house, fled to England with her infant daughter and the remains of a fortune while her elderly father remained trapped in France. Her plan laid out plainly, she would go back for him, one crossing, a month no more. I cannot take you into that furnace, my darling, and so I do the hardest thing a mother has ever done. I leave you in safe hands with everything we have until I return. I have chosen carefully. He is not grand, but he is an Englishman of law, and your grandfather trusted his firm for 30 years. And beneath the letters, flat at the bottom of the box, lay the documents. A marriage certificate, Vivienne's, proving her marriage, proving Margaret legitimate, born in wedlock, with a name and a bloodline as good as anything in that county. A record of baptism, Marguerite. And last, a single sheet of heavy legal paper, a deed of trust drawn in London in English. The entire de Rosso fortune, funds, jewels, plate, all itemized in a clerk's tidy hand until the sums made even a duke blink, conveyed into the keeping of one man, to be held for the child and surrendered upon the mother's return or upon the daughter's majority. The trustee's signature sat at the bottom, brown with age but perfectly clear. Edward Hartwell, solicitor. The library was silent. Hartwell was a asterisk solicitor, Mrs. Bramble whispered, but he's a lord, he's a man who appeared in this county 20 years ago with new money and bought his way up, the Duke said slowly. Bought the manor, bought the connections, married well, everyone assumed an inheritance. He set the deed down with exaggerated care as if it might detonate. There was an inheritance. It belonged to a 2-year-old girl asleep by his kitchen fire. He walked to the window. Outside, the gray morning lay over the land, and somewhere under it, a cart was carrying the rightful owner of everything Edward Hartwell possessed. He couldn't kill her, the Duke said, working it through aloud. 20 years ago some scrap of law clerk caution stayed his hand. A child's death asks questions. A child's asterisk body is evidence. But a nameless kitchen girl who never learns to read, never leaves the grounds, never speaks to a soul above stairs. He turned around. He didn't keep her out of mercy, Mrs. Bramble. He kept her where he could watch her. She wasn't a charity case. She was the asterisk evidence, and he fed his evidence on scraps for 20 years while he dined off her mother's silver. Mrs. Bramble's knuckles were white in her lap, and the mother, Vivienne, she never came back for. She stopped, because the Duke's face had changed, and she remembered at the same moment he did what the box could not tell them and what the Hartwells might, that this story still had a piece missing, and the missing piece was a woman. My father searched for her for years, the Duke said quietly. She had been a guest in his house. He'd sworn her some promise none of us ever knew the shape of. He died with her name in his mouth and a key in his desk. He knew about this box, Mrs. Bramble. She must have written to him, told him it existed, and he could never find it because who searches a asterisk larder floor? A knock, the doors opened. The Duke's steward, mud to the waist, a paper in his hand and a writer still gasping in the hall behind him. Your Grace, from your solicitor. You said everything on the Hartwells 25 years back. The steward swallowed. He started with the money. 3 weeks ago, Lord Hartwell made a payment through a shipping agent in the port town, passage and indenture papers for a female servant unnamed. He held out the sheet. The ship is the asterisk Meridian asterisk, Your Grace, bound for the colonies. When does she sail? The steward's silence was its own answer. When? 3 days, Your Grace. The Duke of Ravensmere looked down at the deed of trust, at the tidy, patient, 20-year-old signature of the man who had stolen a child's whole world, and then complained about the cost of feeding her, and Mrs. Bramble, watching his face, thought, "Lord help Edward Hartwell. Nothing in that cart is as dangerous as what's standing in this library." "Saddle fresh horses," the Duke said. "We ride for the coast." The cart traveled for 2 days, and the man driving it was called Grigsby. Margit learned his name not because he offered it, but because he talked to his horse. He talked to the horse a great deal, in fact, complaints about the road, the weather, his knees, his pay, and to Margit he said almost nothing at all. She had stopped asking where they were going after the first day. The answer was always the same, north. And by the second day she knew it for a lie, because she had watched the morning sun rise squarely ahead of them, mile after mile. They were going east, toward the sea. She was 22 years old and she had never seen the sea. Somewhere under the fear, some small, stubborn corner of her found that almost funny, that her first glimpse of it would be from the back of a prison cart. On the second evening they stopped at a broken down inn where Grigsby knew the landlord, and Margit was given, for the first time in her life, a supper that no one else had touched first. A whole bowl of stew, bread with no mold cut off it. She stared at it, wrists still bound, and something about her stare must have unsettled Grigsby, because he shifted on his bench and pushed the bread closer with one finger. "Eat then, long way tomorrow." "Why?" Margit asked quietly. "Why feed me proper now? 20 years of scraps and a whole bowl the week they throw me away. Does it matter what I weigh where I'm going?" Grigsby grunted and looked into his ale. He was not a kind man, but he was not quite a cruel one either. He was something more common than both. A man who did unpleasant work and told himself stories so he could sleep. "You'll want your strength," he said. "Ship's food is worse." The word landed in the middle of the table. "Ship." "A ship," Margit repeated. Her voice stayed strangely calm. "They said a workhouse in the north." Grigsby's jaw tightened, a man realizing he'd said one word too many, and deciding with a shrug that it hardly mattered now. What could she do? Bound, penniless, nameless, 2 days from anyone who'd ever known her face. "Workhouse ship," he waved his mug. "All the same in the end. Honest labor, foreign parts. 7 years and you're free as a bird, that's what the papers say." He didn't meet her eyes when he said it. Everyone knew what the papers said, and everyone knew what 7 years of indenture did to kitchen girls in the colonies. Margit sat very still. The colonies, an ocean, not a distance you walked back from, not a place a duke's kindness or a cook's love or a strange French song could ever reach. This wasn't punishment. This was asterisk erasure, a girl subtracted from England cleanly forever with paperwork. "You'd think I'd murdered someone," she said softly. "All this. Carts, ships, papers, a hired man, for a scullery girl who sang the wrong song." She looked up. "You've done this work before, Mr. Grigsby. Does his lordship send all his thieving maids across the sea, or just me?" Grigsby said nothing, which was itself an answer. And then, perhaps it was the ale. Perhaps it was the story he told himself needing one more brick. Perhaps it was the plain wrongness of the whole business sitting badly in a man's chest. He said the thing he should never have said. "Shame about your mother, girl." Margit went cold. "My mother died of a fever when I was small." That's what they say, is it?" Grigsby turned his mug slowly on the table, eyes fixed on it, voice dropping to a mutter meant mostly for himself. "All I know is what old Tanner told me, and Tanner drove for his lordship before me, and Tanner drank. She came back for you, you know, once. Foreign lady. Come right up the drive in a hired coach, bold as morning, asking after her daughter." He drained the mug. "They turned her away at the door, told her." He stopped. Even ale has limits. "Told her what?" Margit's voice didn't sound like her own. "Told her what?" Grigsby stood up, suddenly busy with his coat. "Told her nothing, forget it. Tanner was a drunk and I'm a fool. Sleep, we move at first light. But it was too late, and they both knew it. Margaret lay awake that night on the inn's flea-bitten cot, bound wrists on her chest, staring at the ceiling while her whole life quietly took itself apart and reassembled into a different shape. She came back for you. Her mother had not died of a fever in a laundry. Her mother had come up a drive in a hired coach, asking after her daughter Asterisk, and someone in that house had stood at the door and turned her away with a lie. Margaret had been inside, perhaps in the kitchen, perhaps scrubbing a pot 20 feet in one closed door from her own mother's voice. For 20 years she had asked the dark, "What did I do?" And the dark had finally answered, "Nothing. It was never you. It was done to you." The grief of it should have crushed her. Instead, somewhere between midnight and dawn, it caught fire and burned itself into something Margaret had never once been permitted to feel in her whole obedient, grateful, scrap-fed life. Rage. Whoever had stood at that door and lied to her mother had a name. Whoever had bound a 2-year-old's life to a kitchen floor had a reason. And whatever that reason was, it was worth so much that 20 years later they were spending good money to sink her on the far side of an ocean. "You are not what they call you," Mrs. Bramble had said. "You never were." "No," Margaret whispered to the ceiling in English. And then, deliberately, for the first time in her life on purpose, like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath in perfect, aristocratic French. "Non, je ne suis pas." "No, I am not." 40 miles behind her, the Duke of Ravensmere changed horses for the 3rd time at a posting inn and did not stop to eat. His party had split at his order, riders fanning out along every eastbound road with a description of a covered cart, a hired man, and a dark-eyed girl. The Duke himself drove straight for the port, because the port was the one place the cart must eventually be, and 3 days had already shrunk to something closer to 1. Mrs. Bramble had demanded to come. He had refused and then, seeing her face, compromised. She followed a half-day behind in his own carriage, with orders to the coachman that she was to be treated as you would treat my mother. Somewhere past midnight, galloping under a cold spray of stars, the Duke realized he was praying, a thing he had not done since his father's deathbed. Not eloquently. Just 2 words, over and over in rhythm with the hoofbeats, the same 2 words an old cook had once muttered into the rain. "Hold on, hold on, hold on." Ahead, far off at the black edge of the land, he could just make out a faint scatter of lights, the port town. And in its harbor, patient as a trap, the Meridian rode at anchor, taking on cargo. The port town smelled of tar, fish, and departure. The Duke of Ravensmere rode down to the harbor at mid-morning, mud to the shoulders, 3 days of hard road on his face, and found the Meridian exactly where his solicitor's paper had promised. She was a big, blunt, ugly ship, and she was nearly ready. Cargo swung aboard in nets. Water casks rolled up the gangway. A man in a good coat stood at the foot of it with a ledger, and it was to this man, the shipping agent, that the Duke went first, with the 2 riders who had caught up to him at his back. "Your passenger list," the Duke said. "The indentured servants, show me." The agent looked at the mud-covered stranger and began, "And who might you?" At the exact moment, one of the riders murmured, "His Grace the Duke of Ravensmere, and the ledger came open so fast it nearly tore. The Duke ran his finger down the column of names. Laborers, a carpenter and his wife, 4 female servants indentured 7 years apiece. Sarah Willis, Ann Cooper, Mary Fletcher, Jane Dodd. No Margaret, nothing close. There will have been a girl brought in these last 2 days, the Duke said. 22, dark eyes, brought by a hired man in a covered cart, her papers signed away by a Lord Hartwell or by his agent or by no one at all. The agent spread his hands, and his eyes did the thing frightened men's eyes do, a small, involuntary flick, sideways and down, toward the ship. Your Grace, every soul on that list boarded under the name their papers carry. If the papers say Jane Dodd, then Jane Dodd she is. The law asks no more of me. Under the name their papers carry. Of course. You did not erase a girl and then write her true name in a ledger. Hartwell had unmade her one last time, even Margaret asterisk, the scrap name, the kitchen name, taken from her at the water's edge. Then I'll see them, the Duke said. All 4 women on deck now. Your Grace, the master won't. The master, said the Duke, may explain his objections to the magistrate whom I dined with last spring or to me now. He may choose. It took half an hour of shouting, ladder climbing, and the ship's master turning purple. And at the end of it, 4 women stood blinking in the gray light on the Meridian S deck. None of them was Margaret. Sarah Willis was 50 if she was a day. Ann Cooper was fair-haired. Mary Fletcher and Jane Dodd were sisters from the town, indentured together, holding hands. 4 ordinary, frightened women and not one dark-eyed girl who spoke perfect French. The Duke stood on the deck while the harbor went about its business around him, and felt, for the first time in 3 days, the ground give way beneath his certainty. Wrong ship, a second vessel, papers moved, plans changed, had Hartwell outthought him again, was there another port, another? Your Grace, the shipping agent, anxious to be helpful now, anxious to be done. If the girl's not aboard, she's not aboard. The manifest is the manifest. Perhaps your information. My information, the Duke said quietly, cost an old woman 11 miles in the rain. But he turned toward the gangway all the same, because there was nothing left on this deck but strangers, and every hour spent here was an hour the real trail went cold. He was 3 steps from the rail when the wind shifted. Just a small shift, enough to carry sound up out of the ship instead of away from her. The groan of timbers, water slapping the hull, the mutter of the harbor. And underneath it all, faint, rising through the boards of the deck from somewhere deep in the hold. So soft that any man not listening for it his whole life would have walked straight past it, a voice. Singing. A little bird flying home across the sea. The Duke of Ravensmere stopped as if struck. 20 years fell away. He was 14 again, standing in his father's study doorway. Then he turned from the gangway and was moving before any man on that deck understood what was happening, past the master, past the agent, to the hatch. Open it. Your Grace, that's cargo stowage, there's no passengers. Open it. They opened it. And down among the crates and casks and darkness, in a partitioned corner never meant for daylight, sat a girl with bound wrists and a bruised face, dressed in gray, who looked up into the sudden square of sky with eyes he'd have known among 10,000. She had not been put aboard as an indentured servant at all. Servants have papers, and papers can be checked. She had been stowed as freight, signed for, paid for, and consigned like a barrel of anything to disappear. Mademoiselle, the Duke said, and his voice cracked on the word. Margaret stared up at the impossible sight of him, the man from the kitchen yard, mud-covered, wild-eyed, framed in daylight at the top of the ladder, and said the only thing her stunned mind could find in French in a whisper. Vous êtes venu. You came. They brought her up into the light, and that was when the trouble arrived. 3 men came down the dock at a fast walk, hard-faced men in plain clothes, the kind of men who exist in every port for hire, and at their head, hurrying, sweating despite the cold. Lord Hartwell's own steward, who had ridden ahead precisely against this moment, with money in his coat and instructions in his pocket. That woman is contracted cargo, the steward called out loud for the whole dock to hear. Bound over lawfully she goes with the ship, stand away from her. The hired men spread out across the dock between the asterisk meridian and the town. Sailors stopped work to watch. The Duke's 2 riders closed up at his shoulders, hands drifting toward their whips, and for a long, swaying moment the whole harbor balanced on the edge of blood. Margaret felt it, felt the Duke's arm go rigid under her bound hands, felt the dock hold its breath. 3 men, plus the ship's crew, against 3 travel-worn riders. If it came to fists and cudgels, it would be ugly, and it might yet be lost. And then the Duke of Ravensmere did the thing nobody on that dock expected. He let go of his whip. He stepped forward away from his men, out into the open, unarmed, and he raised his voice. Not in rage, in proclamation. The voice of 200 years of men accustomed to being heard, pitched to carry to every sailor, every clerk, every fishwife, and above all to the harbor master, who was at that moment hurrying down the quay to see about the commotion. "My name is Ravensmere," he said. "Mark it, all of you, because you will be asked to remember this morning. This woman is no cargo. She is no servant. She is Mademoiselle Marguerite de Rosso, legitimate daughter of the House of de Rosso, heiress to a fortune that certain men have spent 20 years hoping the sea would swallow." He turned slowly, taking in the hired men one by one. "Her documents of birth and inheritance sit in my strongbox at Ravensmere in copies with my solicitor. So understand your position, every man here. Lay one hand on her and you are not handling freight. You are kidnapping an aristocrat before 40 witnesses, and I will see every man who touches her, every man who paid the men who touch her, answer for it at the assizes. Now." He extended his hand, palm open, into the silence. "Who among you is being paid enough for that?" Nobody moved. The hired men looked at each other. They had been paid to bundle a nameless kitchen thief onto a ship, dirty work, but cheap and safe. The words heiress, witnesses, and assizes were not in the price. One by one, without a signal, they stepped backward, and the steward, abandoned in the middle of the dock with his master's money in his coat, went the color of old suet. The harbor master pushed through the crowd. "What's all this? Whose woman is?" "Mine to protect," the Duke said, "by a promise made before she could walk." He drew his knife and cut the cord from Margaret's wrists, gently, in front of everyone, a small act made enormous by its audience. And the meridian sails 1 passenger light. Margaret stood on the dock, rubbing her freed wrists, 22 years old, looking out past the ship at the wide gray glitter of the first sea she had ever seen. "Your Grace," she said unsteadily, "that name you said, Marguerite de Rosso, is that—" She had to stop and start again. "Is that me?" "It is, it always was. And you can prove it, all of it, who I am, what they did. Every word. It's waiting for you at Ravensmere, letters in your mother's own hand, written to you." He hesitated, then offered it plainly because she had earned plainness. "There is grief in that box, mademoiselle, as well as a fortune. Some of what you'll learn will break your heart." Margaret looked back west, inland, toward the roads that led to Hartwell Manor, to a locked cellar, to a straw mat by a hearth, to 20 years of scraps. "My heart's been breaking for 20 years, Your Grace," she said. "It's time it broke open instead." She lifted her chin. "Take me back. I want to walk through their front door." 2 weeks later, a carriage came up the drive of Hartwell Manor. Not a hired coach, not a cart. A carriage with a ducal crest on its door, drawn by 4 matched greys flanked by riders, and behind it, a second, plainer carriage carrying a London solicitor, a magistrate's clerk, and a locked strongbox. The Hartwells had known for 13 days that it was coming. That was part of the punishment, though no one had designed it that way. 13 days of silence, of the Duke's name in every mouth in the county, of servants giving notice one by one like a house shedding its slates before a storm. Lord Hartwell had written 3 letters to Ravensmere. None had been answered. He had considered flight. Margaret would learn this later, had actually stood in his study one midnight with a valise open on the desk. But flight was confession, and some last gambler's instinct in him still believed the thing could be talked around, managed, settled, the way everything in his life had always been settled, quietly with paper. He was waiting on the front steps when the carriage stopped. Lady Hartwell stood beside him, grey-faced, dressed as if for church. The footman opened the carriage door. The Duke of Ravensmere stepped down first, and then turned and offered his hand. And out of the carriage, onto the gravel of Hartwell Manor, stepped a young woman the household did not recognize for a full 3 seconds. She wore deep blue silk. Her dark hair was dressed high. She was still thin. 2 weeks cannot undo 20 years, but she stood the way her mother had once stood in a duke's study, straight-backed, and her dark eyes moved slowly across the front of the house, the door, the windows, the steps. She had never in her life stood at the front of Hartwell Manor. She had lived 20 years inside it and had never once seen its face. "Smaller than I expected," said Mademoiselle Marguerite de Rosso quietly, and walked up the steps of the house that had been bought with her inheritance. Lord Hartwell had prepared a speech. Margaret watched it die in his mouth as she approached, watched him look, really look at the scullery girl he had stepped past 1,000 times without seeing, and find nowhere left to put his eyes. "Your Grace," he began, "Mademoiselle, there has been a series of grave misunderstandings which I am eager to—" "You will not speak to her," the Duke said. "It was not loud, it did not need to be. You have had 20 years of speaking, today you will listen, inside." They gathered in the great drawing room, the room Margaret had scrubbed the grates of on 100 winter mornings, always before dawn, always before the family woke, so that they might never suffer the sight of her. The solicitor laid it out with terrible, patient tidiness. The deed of trust with Edward Hartwell's own signature. The de Rosso accounts traced through 20 years of purchases, the manor itself, the stables, the very silk on Lady Hartwell's back. The false coroner's tale of a laundress dead of fever for which no record existed in any parish. The forged indenture. The payment to the shipping agent made in Lord Hartwell's own hand 3 weeks past. Fraud, embezzlement of a trust, conspiracy, kidnapping. The clerk's pen scratched on, and with every scratch Lord Hartwell seemed to grow physically smaller in his chair, a man being subtracted from. "Everything you own," the solicitor concluded, "was hers, which means, my lord, that everything you own is hers. The courts will take some months over the details. The conclusion is not in doubt." "There were debts," Lord Hartwell said hoarsely. It was all that was left of him, explanation. The gambler explaining the last hand. "You cannot imagine I was a fortnight from prison when that woman walked into my office. It was only to be a loan, a bridge. I meant to restore every penny, I swear before God, and then France, then years passed, and the sums grew, and there was no way back that did not end on the gallows, and a man protects his family." "By feeding a child scraps," Margaret said. Her voice stopped the room. It was the first time she had spoken since the steps. She rose and walked slowly across the drawing room, past the marble mantel she had polished, over the carpet she had beaten in the yard each spring, and stood before the man who had owned every hour of her life. "I used to make lists," she said, "at night by the hearth, lists of what I might have done. I was 2 years old, so the crimes had to be small. Perhaps I cried too loudly, perhaps I broke something precious. I spent 20 years apologizing to you in my heart, my lord, for a sin I could not remember committing." She tilted her head. "And my sin was arithmetic. I was the number you couldn't make disappear." "Mademoiselle." "But you're not the one I lie awake over," Margaret went on, and turned to the gray-faced woman by the window who had not said one word all morning. "She is, because a man who steals for money I can understand. Greed is simple, but you, my lady, you looked at me every day for 20 years. You ordered me out of sight before every dinner. You told your cook to keep me silent, not out of greed, out of something colder." Margaret took one step closer. There is a piece missing, and I think you have carried it alone all this time, and I think it is heavy asterisk. My mother came to this house once. A man on the road told me. She came up this drive in a hired coach, asking after her daughter, and someone turned her away at that door. The silence in the drawing room had weight. Who spoke to her? Margaret asked softly, and what were the words? Lady Hartwell's composure had survived the solicitor, the deed, the ruin of her whole world. It did not survive the question. She groped behind her for the window seat and sat down abruptly, and when she spoke, her voice came from somewhere 20 years deep. I did, she said. I spoke to her. Edward was in London. It was I who. She came in October. You were 6 years old. You were in the kitchen garden. I could see you from the landing window while I stood at the door. 30 feet. You were pulling carrots. A sound came out of her that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. She was so beautiful. Worn thin, half ruined by what she'd survived in France years. It had taken her years to get free and get back, but beautiful. And I stood in my stolen house in my stolen gown. And I knew that if she saw you, if she took one step past me, we were dead. Both of us. The rope. So you told her. I told her the child was dead. Lady Hartwell said it to the floor. Fever, I said. 3 winters past. I said we had buried her kindly in the parish yard at our own expense out of charity. Her hands twisted in her lap. She asked to see the grave. God help me, I had an answer ready even for that. Edward had prepared it years before, a little stone with no name. He thought of asterisk everything, but she didn't go to it. She simply stood there. I have seen grief, mademoiselle. I have buried my own parents. I have never seen a human face do what hers did. She thanked me. She thanked me for my charity to her daughter and got back into the coach. Margaret stood very still. 30 feet. A landing window. Carrots in the kitchen garden. She had been asterisk outside in October air, close enough that a raised voice would have carried. We had word the following spring, Lady Hartwell finished, barely audible, through the solicitor who had handled arrangements. She died in France that winter. They said her lungs, but I knew. I have known for 16 years exactly what she died of, and I have sat in this room every day since, and some mornings I could hear you singing in the kitchen, her songs and her voice, and it was like the house itself was. She stopped. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. You asked what I felt when I looked at you. Not hatred, child. Never hatred, haunting. You were the ghost of the worst thing I ever did, and you lit my fires every morning. No one spoke for a long time. Margaret had thought, for 2 weeks she had thought, that when this moment came she would rage. She had rehearsed rage on the road. But standing in that drawing room, looking at the ruin of these 2 people, the shrunken gambler, the haunted woman, she found the rage had already burned through and left something stranger behind. A grief so large it had no room in it for anything smaller. Her mother had crossed a burning country twice, had survived what killed nearly everyone she loved, had stood 30 feet away and been murdered, as surely as by any blade, by a sentence spoken on a doorstep. The magistrate will decide what the law takes from you, Margaret said finally, and her voice was steady in a way that frightened the Hartwells more than shouting. The house, the money, your liberty, that is arithmetic, and arithmetic was always your God, let it judge you. But I will take one thing myself before I leave this room. She looked at Lady Hartwell. You will write it down, everything. That October day, word for word, what she wore, what she asked, how her voice sounded. Every detail you have hoarded for 16 years. Because you are the last living person who spoke with my mother, and you owe me her final hour. That is your debt to me, my lady. The rest is only money. Lady Hartwell looked up at the kitchen girl in blue silk, and perhaps the first honest act of her married life bowed her head. Every word, she whispered. Every word, I swear it. Margaret did not stay to watch the magistrate's men. She walked out through the front door, out asterisk, this time. The direction mattered, and down the steps, and across the gravel. And she did not stop until she reached the low wall of the kitchen garden, where the last of the winter carrots stood in their frost-blackened rows. The Duke followed at a distance and waited, and after a while came to stand beside her at the wall. "My father made her a promise," he said quietly. It was time. He had been carrying it since the library. I pieced it together from his letters these past 2 weeks. She came to him that same autumn after this house, after the lie. She was sailing back to France to settle her affairs. She no longer believed she had anything to stay for, but some part of her doubted, mademoiselle. Some part of her never fully believed you were in that grave. Mothers don't, I think. So she told my father everything, the trust, Hartwell's name, the writing box, the key. And she asked him if I am wrong to leave, if there was ever a child of mine alive in England, find her, protect her. He looked down at his hands on the wall. He searched for years. Hartwell had buried the trail too well. There was nothing to connect a French heiress to a scullery child, and my father died believing he had failed her. He gave me the key with almost his last breath and could not even tell me what it opened. I have carried it for 2 years without understanding it. He paused. Then I dropped a fork at a dinner party. Margaret laughed, a small, cracked, astonished laugh, the first in weeks, and wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand like the kitchen girl she had been. "So your father searched for me, and you finished it?" "No," said the Duke. "A cook finished it, 11 miles in the rain. I merely rode fast at the end." He turned to face her, and the famously unreadable man was suddenly, visibly, readable and terrified. "Mademoiselle de Rosso, Marguerite, you are about to become one of the wealthiest women in this county, with a name older than mine and the whole world newly open to you, and any man who speaks now will rightly be suspected of speaking to the fortune. I know it. I have argued myself out of this a dozen times on the road." He took a breath. "But I watched you in a kitchen yard with bruises on your wrists, apologizing for spilled water, and I thought even then, before the box, before the name, there is the finest lady I have ever met. So I will say it plainly and once, and you may do with it what you wish. I am asking for your hand, not the heiress's, yours, the girl who feared for my boots." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. This man who had crossed a county in the rain for a scullery maid, who had won her back with a name instead of a sword, who had waited 2 weeks and said nothing until her own battles were fought. "Your Grace," she said, "I have spent my whole life eating what was left over, being what was left over." Her chin came up and her mother's eyes were bright. "I find I am done with scraps. If I take your hand, it will not be as a rescue. It will be as an equal or not at all." "Mademoiselle," said the Duke of Ravensmere, "I would not dare offer less." And there, at the wall of the kitchen garden, where a 6-year-old had once pulled carrots 30 feet from her mother's breaking heart, Marguerite de Rosso gave her answer, in the language that had saved her life, the language that was her inheritance, the language of a lullaby about a little bird flying home. "Alors oui," she said, "de tout mon cœur oui." Then yes, with all my heart, yes. 1 year later, Ravensmere Castle was giving its first grand dinner under its new Duchess, and half the county had schemed for months to be invited. They came full of curiosity, of course. Everyone knew the story by now, everyone in 3 counties knew it, and most of them had improved it in the telling. The kitchen girl who turned out to be an heiress, the lullaby through the dinner party door, the old cook who walked 11 miles in the rain, the Hartwells stripped by the courts of house, fortune, and name, the manor sold, his lordship awaiting the assizes, her ladyship living on the charity of a cousin in the north who reminded her of it daily. But the guests who came to gawk at a scandal went home talking about something else entirely. They talked about the Duchess herself, how she greeted every guest in flawless English and every French émigré in flawless French, how she seemed to know the name of every footman who served the soup, how the famously unreadable Duke of Ravensmere watched his wife across the table all evening with an expression his neighbors had never seen on him and could only describe, inadequately, as asterisk undone asterisk. And one guest, the vicar's wife, who noticed things, talked about the strangest detail of all. She had taken a wrong turn looking for the retiring room and passed the door to the kitchen stairs, and through it had drifted the smell of the very same pheasant, the very same wine sauce, being served at that moment in the dining room above. Curious, she had asked her maid about it later, and the maid had confirmed it wide-eyed. It was a standing order at Ravensmere, the first order the new Duchess had ever given her household, written in her own hand and posted in the kitchen where every servant could see it. The staff of this house dines on what the guests dine on, no exceptions, no scraps. There was more the vicar's wife didn't see. She didn't see the snug stone cottage at the edge of the park, with roses waiting for spring and a fire always lit, where a retired cook named Mrs. Bramble lived like a dowager, and complained magnificently about having nothing to do. She didn't see that a chair stood by the Duchess's own sitting-room fire that no one else was permitted to occupy, or that twice a week an old woman marched up to the castle, inspected the kitchens without any authority whatsoever, terrorized the new cook with suggestions, and then took tea with a Duchess who still, when the door was closed, called her Mrs. Bramble dear, and was still told asterisk hush, child in return. And no one in England at all saw the small churchyard in France, where that spring a fine new stone had been raised over a grave neglected for 17 years, white marble, a bird in flight over 3 stars, and beneath the name asterisk Vivienne de Rosso, a single line in 2 languages, chosen by the daughter who had knelt there for a long time with her husband standing quietly back. The little bird came home. Late that night, when the last carriage had rolled away and the great house had gone quiet, the Duke of Ravensmere went looking for his wife, and found her where he knew he would, in the nursery, in the low chair by the cradle, in the small circle of light from a shaded lamp. Their daughter had been born in the autumn. She had her father's stubborn chin and her mother's dark, wide-set eyes, the de Rosso eyes, arrived safe in their 3rd generation, and she had been named before she was born, before she was even hoped for, in a promise her parents had made at a graveside in France. Vivienne. She wouldn't sleep, the Duchess whispered. She has your talent for defiance. She has your talent for staying awake and watching people. Margaret smiled and looked down into the cradle, where 2 dark eyes were indeed watching, fighting sleep with all the sovereign fury of the very small. There's only one remedy. You know that. I know it, said the Duke, and settled onto the arm of the chair, his hand on his wife's shoulder. Sing. And so, in the great castle of Ravensmere in the warm dark, the Duchess began to sing, softly, in perfect, old-fashioned, aristocratic French, a lullaby about a little bird flying home across the sea. The same song a heartbroken woman had once sung by a fire in that very house, 30 feet from a Duke's study door. The same song a scullery girl had sung over the pots at Hartwell Manor, forgetting for one fatal, miraculous moment to be invisible. It had crossed an ocean of grief to arrive in this room. It had been a mother's love, a hidden key, a cook's secret, a dying man's promise, and the single dropped fork that brought down a house of thieves. And now it was only what it had always been meant to be, a song for a sleeping child, sung in safety, in a home no one could ever take away. The small dark eyes surrendered at last. Margaret sat listening to her daughter breathe, in the house where every fire was warm and every door was open to her, and thought of a girl on a straw mat who had once asked the dark what she had done to deserve so little, and of how the answer had come, in the end, not from the dark at all, but from everyone who had loved her. A cook, a mother, a duke, and a song. Below stairs, the kitchen was banked and quiet, the larders full, the staff long since gone to their beds, every one of them on the same supper the county's finest had praised at the Duchess's table. No one in that house would ever eat scraps again. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.